A man who has not set foot in Moscow in months lands in the Russian capital under total secrecy. 48 hours later, missiles and drones are falling on 9 Ukrainian cities at once. Grain ports, power stations, apartment blocks in one of the widest single night barrages of the entire war. Was that a coincidence, or was it a message timed and aimed, sent the moment the American plane left Russian airspace? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what happened this week could be the opening move of the most dangerous phase of this war so far, and almost nobody outside a handful of intelligence officials saw it coming until it was already burning. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's set the scene properly, because the details matter here, and the timing matters even more. Earlier this week, CIA Director John Ratcliffe quietly flew into Moscow. Not a press conference, not a photo op with flags in the background. A secretive trip that only came to light after American reporters started asking questions the White House couldn't fully deny. This was Ratcliffe's first known visit to Russia as CIA chief, and if you know your history, you know exactly why that single fact should raise the hair on your arms. Because the last time a sitting CIA director made a trip like this to Moscow, it was 2021. The director was William Burns, and the message he carried, delivered personally and privately to the Kremlin, was a warning against a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 3 months later, Russian tanks crossed the border anyway. So when history rhymes this closely, a CIA director, a secret Moscow trip, a warning about escalation, you have to ask yourself, is Washington trying to prevent history from repeating, or are we already watching the opening chapter of a sequel nobody wants to admit is starting? Here's what we know for certain. According to multiple US and international outlets, Ratcliffe's trip was built around one core message: a warning to Russia not to attack a NATO member state. Not Ukraine this time. NATO, that's the country in the room that nobody said out loud until now. And once you say it, the entire strategic picture shifts. This wasn't just another diplomatic check in about the war grinding through its 5th year. This was about the next war, the one that could pull in American troops, European armies, and Article 5 of the NATO treaty itself. Now pause on that for a second, because the stakes here are not abstract. Article 5 means an attack on one NATO member is treated as an attack on all of them. It means American soldiers stationed in Poland or the Baltics could suddenly find themselves in a shooting war with Russia, not because Washington chose it, but because a line was crossed on a map. That is the scenario intelligence officials are reportedly worried enough about that they sent the head of the CIA halfway across the world to say, in as many words, don't. So why now? Why would American intelligence believe in the summer of 2026 that Vladimir Putin might be preparing to test a NATO country directly? The reporting suggests US intelligence assessed that Putin could attempt a limited assault on an allied nation within the next few years, testing not Ukraine's resolve, which has already been tested for 4.5 brutal years, but NATO's, testing whether the alliance would actually fight for a small member state or whether it would hesitate, debate, and let the moment slip. That is the nightmare scenario European defense planners have been war gaming quietly for months, and now it's spilling into daylight. But here's where it gets murkier, and this is the part that should make you lean in closer. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters that Ratcliffe never actually met with Putin himself. The contact, he said, happened at the level of the intelligence services, spy to spy, not president to spy chief. Peskov called it positive, but refused to say whether it would change anything about the deep freeze in US-Russia relations. Translation: something happened in that room, but neither side wants to tell you exactly what. And that silence is its own kind of warning. And then, less than 48 hours later, the skies over Ukraine lit up. On Thursday, Russia launched one of the most geographically sweeping missile and drone assaults of the entire war, striking 9 separate Ukrainian cities in a single overnight barrage. Not one city, not a targeted strike on a military base. 9 cities, from Kyiv in the north to Odesa in the south, hit almost simultaneously. Grain elevators went up in flames. Energy facilities were hit, cutting power to entire districts. Residential buildings, a school, a medical facility, all struck in a night that Ukrainian officials say was no accident of scheduling. Think about that timing again. Ratcliffe leaves Moscow. Less than 2 days pass, and then Russia unleashes a barrage wide enough to hit ports and power grids from one end of the country to the other. Kyiv noticed. Officials there have openly said the timing was not lost on them. Was this Putin's answer to Washington's warning? A demonstration that he'll strike wherever and whenever he wants, warning or no warning? Or was this simply the continuation of a bombing campaign that's been building for weeks, regardless of who visited Moscow? That is the question hanging over every defense ministry in Europe right now, and nobody has a clean answer. Let's talk about what actually got hit, because this wasn't random. Odesa's grain infrastructure took a direct hit, and that detail alone should worry you even if you've never thought about Ukraine's ports before. Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative back in 2023, and ever since, it has systematically targeted Ukraine's export corridor, the silos, the warehouses, the loading terminals that get Ukrainian wheat and corn onto ships bound for Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Thursday's strike wasn't an isolated event. It was the continuation of a 3-year campaign to strangle Ukraine's ability to feed export markets that depend on it. And when Ukrainian grain exports get strangled, global food prices don't stay a regional story. They become everyone's story on every continent, at every grocery checkout line. In the Poltava region, industrial facilities and energy infrastructure were struck, cutting power to 7 separate settlements in one night. Imagine that families going to sleep with electricity and waking up to darkness, cold water, and no idea how long the outage will last, because a decision made in Moscow decided their power grid was a target. Meanwhile, in Kyiv itself, 4 districts were struck: a school, a medical facility, residential buildings. Officials reported no casualties within the capital that night, which is close to a miracle given the scale of the assault. But residents still spent the night sheltering in metro stations as drones and missiles worked their way across the sky above them. Now here's a secondary thread you need to keep in the back of your mind, because it's about to become very relevant. This escalation isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening as Ukraine has been striking back deep inside Russian territory, hitting Black Sea ports and military assets on the occupied Crimean Peninsula with growing frequency and growing confidence. For the first time in a long time, Kyiv has real momentum, striking Russian refineries, Russian export terminals, Russian military assets far from the front lines. Russia's own economy is starting to feel the pressure of Ukrainian long-range strikes, which raises an uncomfortable question. Is Thursday's 9-city barrage retaliation, escalation, or both at once, each side ratcheting the war a notch higher while the rest of the world watches and hopes it doesn't spiral further? And here's where the NATO arms question comes back into focus. The part of this story that's still murky, still developing, and still worth watching closely over the next few days. Reports around the Ratcliffe visit specifically flagged concerns that Russia might test NATO resolve with a limited strike on Allied territory or Allied assets. Whether Thursday's barrage crossed anywhere near that line, or whether it stayed entirely inside Ukraine's borders while simply escalating the intensity, is something analysts are still parsing as new details emerge. What is confirmed is that Western-supplied weapons and NATO military assistance have increasingly become part of Russia's targeting calculus throughout this war. Depots, supply routes, and logistics hubs tied to Allied support have all been struck at various points over the past several years. Whether this specific barrage was aimed at sending a message about that support or was simply the next chapter in Russia's long campaign against Ukraine's ports and energy grid is exactly the kind of question that deserves careful tracking rather than a rushed answer. And it's exactly why you should not look away from this story over the coming days. Now let's bring President Trump into this picture because his reaction tells you almost as much as the strikes themselves. Speaking before the barrage even hit, Trump downplayed the odds of Russia attacking NATO territory directly, and he declined to confirm whether Ratcliffe had actually delivered a direct warning to Putin at all. He described the trip as semi-routine. He said his own conversations with the Russian president had reassured him that such a plan wasn't seriously in the cards. That's a strikingly different tone from an administration that reportedly sent its top spy to Moscow specifically to issue a warning. Somebody's narrative doesn't quite match the reporting, and when the public story and the classified reality start to diverge like that, it's usually a sign that there's more happening behind closed doors than anyone in front of a microphone is willing to admit. At the same time, Trump has been positioning himself as a broker trying to end this war, not escalate it. He's pushed for his envoys, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, to travel to Kiev and restart negotiations. Zelensky, for his part, has been pressing hard for exactly that kind of direct engagement, hoping fresh American involvement can pull this conflict toward a negotiated end rather than another year of grinding attrition. But negotiations aside, city bombing runs don't exactly send the same signal to the world. One suggests de-escalation is possible. The other suggests someone in Moscow wants leverage on the table before any serious talks begin. Which one wins out in the coming weeks could define how the rest of this year unfolds and could determine whether Europe stays a spectator to this war or becomes a participant in it. Let's zoom out for a moment because it's easy to get lost in the details of any single night's strikes and lose sight of the bigger picture building underneath all of this. This war has now ground on for more than 4.5 years. It has outlasted predictions of quick collapse on both sides. It has survived shifting American administrations, European election cycles, and multiple rounds of failed diplomacy. And now, in its 5th year, it's entering a phase where the central question is no longer just who wins in Ukraine. It's, does this stay contained to Ukraine at all? That is the shift that Ratcliffe's trip, whatever was actually said in that room, represents. American intelligence is worried enough about the war spilling beyond Ukraine's borders that they sent their top spy to say so in person at the highest levels available to them. And if you're watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or anywhere across Europe, this isn't a distant story anymore. NATO's collective defense commitment means that if Putin ever does test an allied nation, a Baltic state, a Polish border town, anywhere under Article 5's protection, the war doesn't stay a headline about a country far away. It becomes a question about whether your country's troops, your country's resources, and potentially your country's young men and women get pulled into a direct confrontation with a nuclear armed power. That's not fear-mongering. That's the literal architecture of the alliance every NATO member has signed on to. It's exactly why a secret CIA visit to Moscow and a 9-city barrage 48 hours later deserves your full attention rather than a passing scroll on your phone. Let's talk for a moment about the machinery behind all of this, because the technology doing the killing has changed dramatically even in just the last 2 years of this war, and understanding it helps explain why a single night can now hit 9 cities at once in a way that simply wasn't possible earlier in the conflict. Russia's strike packages increasingly combine long-range ballistic and cruise missiles with swarms of cheap, mass-produced one-way attack drones launched in overlapping waves designed to overwhelm air defense systems rather than defeat them head-on. The logic is brutally simple. Interceptors cost far more than the drones being fired at them, so every night Ukraine's air defense batteries spend expensive missiles shooting down cheap drones. The economics of this war tilt a little further in Russia's favor. That's part of why grain ports, power stations, and civilian infrastructure keep getting hit even when the world's attention is elsewhere. It's not just about destruction, it's about attrition, forcing Ukraine to burn through irreplaceable air defense stockpiles month after month. On the other side, Ukraine has spent the past 2 years building its own long-range strike capability almost from scratch, and that shift is arguably one of the most underreported stories of this entire war. Domestically produced drones now regularly reach deep into Russian territory, hitting refineries, export terminals, and military logistics hubs hundreds of kilometers from the front line, strikes that would have been unthinkable in the war's first year. This is why you're seeing Russian officials increasingly frustrated in state media, and why Russia's own economy is beginning to show cracks tied directly to lost refining capacity and disrupted exports. Both sides, in other words, have industrialized long-range strike warfare, and that arms race in drone and missile technology is precisely what makes nights like Thursday's 9 city barrage possible at a scale that simply didn't exist a few years ago. Now, why does that technological shift matter for the NATO question specifically? Because the same drone and missile technology capable of reaching deep into Russia or striking across all of Ukraine in a single night is, in theory, also capable of testing a border further west. Defense analysts across Europe have spent the last year openly discussing scenarios in which Russia probes NATO airspace or territory using exactly this kind of asymmetric, deniable toolkit. A drone incursion here, an unexplained explosion there, each individually below the threshold that would trigger a unified NATO response, but cumulatively designed to test how the alliance reacts under ambiguity. That is the scenario Ratcliffe's warning was reportedly aimed at heading off, and it's why military planners aren't just watching missile counts. They're watching patterns, watching for the kind of gray zone testing that doesn't look like a full invasion until suddenly it does. There's also a financial and industrial dimension to this that rarely makes the headlines, but shapes everything happening on the battlefield. Western nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and multiple European governments, have poured billions into weapons production lines specifically to keep pace with the scale of this war, expanding artillery shell manufacturing, air defense interceptor production, and drone components at a rate none of them anticipated needing when this conflict began. Every strike on Ukrainian infrastructure is, in a very real sense, also a strike on the sustainability of that Western supply chain, testing whether allied nations can keep producing and shipping weapons faster than Russia can absorb and adapt to them. If Thursday's barrage really was timed as a message following Ratcliffe's visit, that message wasn't just aimed at Kiev or at Washington's intelligence community. It was aimed at every taxpayer and every defense ministry currently deciding how much longer and how much more they're willing to invest in keeping Ukraine's defenses standing. So where does this go from here? A few threads to watch. And I want you to keep these in your mind over the coming days and weeks, because each one could be the next major turn in this story. First, Watch whether Russia's strikes continue targeting Ukraine's port and grain infrastructure at this intensity, because that campaign has global food price implications that reach far beyond Eastern Europe. Second, watch whether any Western officials confirm or deny that NATO-linked assets, weapons shipments, or supply routes were specifically targeted in this barrage or the next one, because that's the tripwire everyone in Brussels and Washington is quietly watching. Third, watch whether Kushner and Witkoff actually make that trip to Kiev, because that would be the clearest signal yet that genuine negotiations, not just posturing, are back on the table. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, watch whether there's a next visit like Ratcliffe trips, another quiet trip, another unconfirmed warning. Because if this becomes a pattern rather than a one-off, that tells you Washington believes the risk of this war crossing into NATO territory is not hypothetical anymore. It's a live possibility being managed in real time, one secret meeting at a time. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Wars like this one don't usually announce their turning points in advance. Nobody in February 2022 got an alert telling them the full invasion was about to begin until it did. Nobody knew in the days before Burns's 2021 Moscow trip that his warning would fail to stop what came next. History doesn't send you a countdown clock. It sends you moments like this one, a quiet flight into Moscow, a denial from the Kremlin, and then fire raining down on 9 cities 48 hours later, and it asks you quietly whether you were paying attention when it mattered. And here's one more thread worth sitting with before we close this out. Every major escalation in this war has, in hindsight, looked obvious. The buildup along the border in early 2022, the withdrawal from the grain deal in 2023, the steady drumbeat of long-range strikes creeping further from the front line each year since. In the moment, though, each of those looked like just another news cycle, another round of statements and denials, easy to scroll past. The pattern only becomes visible once you connect the dots after the fact, and by then, the window to react has usually already closed. That's the real danger buried inside a story like this one, not any single strike and not any single visit to Moscow, but the accumulation of small, deniable moves that only reveal their true shape once enough of them have piled up. Whether Thursday's barrage turns out to be one more data point in that pattern, or the moment the pattern finally broke into something bigger, is something we may not know for certain for weeks. But you'll be far better positioned to see it coming if you're tracking it now in real time, rather than reading about it after the fact in a headline that finally forces everyone to pay attention. That's why this channel exists. Not to sensationalize war for clicks, but to make sure you understand the moves being made on this board before the consequences show up on your evening news with no context attached. Because by the time a story like this becomes impossible to ignore, the decisions that shaped it were usually made weeks or months earlier, in rooms nobody was allowed to record. So here is what I need from you. Do not treat this as just another headline that scrolls past in 30 seconds. This is a live, moving situation with a nuclear armed power, a fracturing peace process, and an alliance whose credibility is being quietly tested in real time. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because if this pattern continues, if there's another secret visit, another denial, another barrage 48 hours later, you need to know within minutes, not days. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think Thursday's strikes were a direct response to Ratcliffe's warning, or simply the next chapter in a bombing campaign that's been building for months, regardless of who visited Moscow. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of debate that helps all of us understand what's actually happening faster than the mainstream headlines catch up. Share this video with anyone you know who still thinks this war is contained, predictable, or far away, because the honest answer right now is that nobody fully knows where the next 48 hours lead. Stay alert, stay informed, and I will see you in the next video the moment there's something new to report.